So today's daf is Samech Vav in Eruvin. We're going to begin at the very first line in Samech Vav Amud Aleph, which is a conclusion of the case that we talked about yesterday. The case that we talked about yesterday was the Rabbanim who were all staying in an inn, and what happened was that they made an Eruv prior to Shabbat, but the non-Jew shows up on Shabbat itself. And the question is, can we do sechirut? Can we rent the portion from the non-Jew on Shabbat? Because we know normally if the non-Jew had been there from before Shabbat, we would have rented his rights to the courtyard, the shared courtyard, and then we would have made the Eruv. But he wasn't there. He comes on Shabbat itself. So the question was, do we consider the rental from the non-Jew like an Eruv itself, in which case it needs to be done before Shabbat? Or is the renting from the non-Jew considered like bitul reshut, nullifying your rights to the chatzer? Because we know that you can nullify, you can give up your rights to someone else, and you can switch back and forth on Shabbat itself. That's no problem. So the answer that they gave was that, you know what, we can rent even on Shabbat from the non-Jew. Now obviously not using money, but using some other object of value to effectuate the rental, so that way that he wouldn't ruin their ability to use the courtyard. And how that would work would be, they made an Eruv before. When the non-Jew shows up, basically his presence destroys the Eruv, it doesn't work anymore. So now what do you have to do? You have to rent from him, and what we can do now is, everybody can nullify their rights to one guy, and then that guy can nullify his rights back to another guy. In other words, they can keep doing that the rest of Shabbat. They can't reconstitute the Eruv, because once the non-Jewish guy shows up, it undermines the Eruv they made before Shabbat. But what they can do is at least nullify now. Each individual can nullify his reshut. Everyone together can nullify theirs to one person. That person will be able to carry in and out of the chatzer. Then he can go back and give the rights to someone else. They can, and so on and so forth. So we're at the top of Samech Vav Ta'u ba Nahar Da'eh, that the people of Nahar Da'ah were shocked or were perplexed by this statement here of Rabbi Yochanan, that Rabbi Yochanan said that they did the right thing by renting from the non-Jew on Shabbat. That was the right thing to do. So, Omi Amar Rabbi Yochanan Hachi, did Rabbi Yochanan really say this? Rabbi Yochanan socher keme'arev dameh. Didn't Rabbi Yochanan say that socher keme'arev, that when you rent from the non-Jew in order to complete the Eruv, it's similar to me'arev. It has the same status as making an Eruv, meaning, my love ma me'arev mi ba'od yom af socher mi ba'od yom. Doesn't that mean that just like an Eruv has to be made from the previous day, so too sechirut, so too if you rent from the non-Jew, it has to be done from Erev Shabbat, not on Shabbat itself? No, that's not necessarily true. Ma me'arev va'afilu p'pachot mishaveh pruta. Av socher b'pachot mishaveh pruta, u'ma me'arev afilu sechiro l'kito, av socher afilu sechiro l'kito. That the equation wasn't saying that just like the Eruv must be done before Shabbat, so too the rental from the non-Jew has to be done before Shabbat. What it meant was that just like Eruv, your contribution, let's say if 10 people in the courtyard, sharing the courtyard, each person is supposed to give something towards the Eruv. You don't have to give something that's worth a peruta. You don't have to give something of any minimal value. Even if it's less than minimal value, it's still significant. So too with the rental. We said the rental that you make from the idolater can be even less than a peruta, even less than what's normally considered a significant amount of money, or a halachically recognized amount of money. And similarly, just like the sechiro ulkito, the employee, the worker, can participate in the Eruv on behalf of the owner of the house. In other words, even his worker, let's say, for example, according to Rashi, even if the owner of the house is not Jewish, but he has a worker who's Jewish, the worker can join the Eruv, and now it's considered like the non-Jew's household is joining the Eruv. Right? So that's how Rashi interprets it. Others interpret it differently. That's how Rashi interprets it. As we learned earlier, that you could try to get someone to infiltrate and get hired by the non-Jew, or otherwise get involved with the non-Jew in a way that he gets a piece of his land and is borrowing a piece of his land, and then he's able to participate in the Eruv. So too with the Sechirut, if you want to rent from the non-Jew, you can rent even from his employee, even though the employee doesn't legally have the right to rent it. Since it's just a symbolic rental, it's a token rental, you're allowed to do it that way. But it's not to say that Rabbi Yochanan meant that the sechirut has to take place before Shabbat. It's possible that you could rent from the non-Jew even on Shabbat if the non-Jew shows up on Shabbat and undermines your Eruv. So now the Gemara goes on. Uma me'arev chamisha sheshruyin b'chatzer achat echad me'arev al yedei kulan. Socher nami chamisha sheshruyin b'chatzer achat And just like when it comes to the Eruv, even if you have 5 people in an Eruv, you can have one person, you have 5 people in a Chatzer rather, you can have one person make the Eruv for everyone. And what it means is, let's say you have 2 Chatzerot that are adjacent to one another, and the 2 Chatzerot have a door in between them, and they want to make themselves all one Chatzer. So you have 5 in one and 5 in the other. So let's say that the Chatzer on the left wants to join the Chatzer on the right. So one person from the Chatzer on the left can go over to the Chatzer on the right and give to their Eruv to unite the 2 Chatzerot. It's not that all 5 families have to go one by one and join with the families in the other Chatzer. One representative family from the one Chatzer has to go and join with the other Chatzer. And similarly, when it comes to renting from the non-Jew, not every member of the Chatzer has to go rent from the non-Jew. Let's say there are 10 people. It doesn't have to be all 10. One person goes and rents on behalf of everybody. So that's the way that Rabbi Yochanan was saying that making an Eruv and renting are similar. They're similar in that they can both be done for less than a peruta, the participation in the Eruv and the rental. They can both be done using someone who's not necessarily completely legal representative of the individual, because they're an employee of the individual. And they can both be done by a shaliach. You can have one representative contract the rental or participate in the Eruv on behalf of everybody in the group. You don't have to have each individual participate. But they're different because Eruv has to be done before Shabbat, and Sechirut can be done even on Shabbat. So now the Gemara goes on and says, Taheba Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar was also perplexed by, reflecting on, trying to understand this halacha. But it doesn't say what was bothering him. Amar Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera says, Mai tahayad Rabbi Elazar. What was the problem that was vexing Rabbi Elazar here? Amar Rav Sheshet. Rav Sheshet says, Gavra Rabaki Rabbi Zera lo yada mai tahaya Rabbi Elazar. Such a great person as Rabbi Zera doesn't know what was bothering Rabbi Elazar. How could you not know? What was bothering him was the statement of Shmuel, his teacher. Damar Shmuel, because Shmuel said, Kol makom she'osrinu ma'arevin mivatlin. Okay, so any place that there's prohibition and you can make an eruv mivatlin. We're going to see the examples of this in a second. Then you can also do bitul reshut. What that means is any place where you have individuals whose presence will ruin the ability of the other individuals to carry in the Chatzer. Okay, so for example, let's say you have 5 people living in the Chatzer, and one of them is a holdout. He refuses to, he doesn't want to participate in the Eruv. That's Osrin. So now he's Oser the other ones. The other ones now can't carry in the Chatzer either, because now there's a multiplicity of participants. The 4 joined into 1, but number 5 is separate, so there's still 2. So we have a problem. We have 2 entities operating in the Chatzer. That's no good. So it says any place Osrin U'Ma'arevin that there's prohibition and there's Eruv, there's the possibility of Eruv, Mivatlin, there's also the possibility of Bitul Reshut. Let's say the 5th guy says, listen, I'm not going to participate in your Eruv, but I will nullify my rights in the Chatzer and give them to you. So that's also good. So then we have me'arevin ve'en osrin ve'en me'arevin en mevatlin. But if you have a case where me'arevin ve'en osrin, where you can create eruv, but there's no prohibition if you don't create an eruv. We'll see what that example is. Or she'osrin, that there's a prohibition ve'en me'arevin, but there's no way to correct it. There's no way to make an eruv. And we'll see what case that is in a second. In Mivatlin, then Bitul Reshut also won't help you. So let's see what these cases are. Any place where you have a prohibition and there's a possibility of making an eruv, you can also do Bitul Reshut. It's talking about Kigon Bet Chatzerot Zolifnim Mizo. That's talking about where you have one Chatzer inside of the other one. In other words, you have an inner Chatzer that's like a dead end. It's closed on all sides, that empties into another Chatzer. And that Chatzer empties into the Mavoy, or the public domain. So, and I think they have on the side, in mine they have on the side a picture, but it doesn't matter. The point is, one's called the outer Chatzer, one's called the inner. The inner is the one that there's no way out except through the outer Chatzer. So that's a case where Osrin, since the inner Chatzer is going to use the outer Chatzer as its way out, So it prohibits the outer chaser. We learned about that before. It's going to create a prohibition for the outer chaser, because it's going to create a situation where the inner chaser by itself, they could be closed off from the outer chaser, they have no problem. But since the inner chaser is going to go through the outer chaser, and they're going to utilize the outer chaser to get out of their development, basically, so they create a prohibition for the person on the outside. Because the person on the outside is sharing his space with the person on the inside, and not vice versa necessarily. But definitely in that direction it is. So that's a case where there's Isur. If they don't make an Eruv, then En Mevatlin. Then Mevatlin. You can have Bitul, meaning to say that the person in the outer Chatzer can actually be Mevatel, can say, you know what, I give up my rights to my outer Chatzer, so you inner people now can use my Chatzer, and I'm not going to use it. Okay, let's say there's one guy living in the inner chatzir and one guy in the outer. The guy in the inner says, I'm not going to carry anything out of my house. You can have it. I'm mivatel it to you. That's fine. The people on the inside aren't going to be mivatel to the person on the outside necessarily. But the point is that, bitul will work here. It will work here because there's a prohibition that otherwise will be in effect if they don't make an eruv. Okay, so Rashi explains this. He says, let's say a situation where the inner chatzer didn't make an eruv at all. So asra achitzona afilu lerabanan de pligia Rabbi Akiva. So in other words, even in a case, because we had a machloket that the rabbis and Rabbi Akiva had a difference of opinion about to what extent the inner chatzer will affect the outer chatzer. But definitely, if the inner chatzer did not make an eruv, they didn't make an eruv at all, and they are open to the outer chatzer, and they pass through the outer chatzer. So in that case, they prohibit the outer chatzer as well, because modu de regela oseret bimkoma oser shelo bimkoma. Because since the people in their own chatzer are prohibited to move around, because the inner chatzer didn't make an eruv. Let's say there's more than one person living in there, they didn't make an eruv. Now they're going to prohibit the outer chatzer as well, because they open right to the outer chatzer. So the outer chatzer is going to be influenced as well. So now they create a problem for everybody. Okay? But if they wanted to make an eruv, all of them together, they could have done that. But they didn't. Okay, so in that case, so then in this situation, in other words, the inner chatzer people, right, they forgot to make an eruv. So in their own chatzer, they can't carry anyway. So what they do is they say to the people in the outer chatzer, we're going to give up our right to carry things through your chatzer. Why? Because we're just impinging upon you. We didn't make an eruv. So we didn't make an eruv amongst ourselves, and we didn't make an eruv with you. But we don't want to prohibit you from using your own chatzer.
What's the prohibition again?
Because since
the inner chatzer failing to deliver makes on the outer one, what's the automatic prohibition?
They automatically prohibit, because since even in their own place they're not allowed to carry, and they pass through the outer chatzer to get out, and so therefore they have a certain level of rights to the outer chatzer also, because they have to pass through it in order to get out of the development. So because of that, they create an automatic prohibition on the outer chatzer as well. Or they're automatically considered mixed with the outer chatzer as well, and since they didn't make an eruv for themselves, they also mess up for the outer. So what they can do is say, you know what? We give up our rights to the outer chatzer. We're going to give it up to you, and that way, at least it won't impinge upon you, who live in the outer chatzer.
So the inner chatzer.
We're not going to go out.
They can't carry any place.
Right? They can't carry any place anyway. So they say, you know what? We're not going to go out this Shabbat. We're not going to exit the development. We're not going to go out. We give you our rights to the chatzer. We're not going to bring anything. We're not going to bring anything. Now, obviously, they can't bring anything from their chatzer into the other chatzer anyway, because they can't carry anything, right? But technically, they have the right to move things around. Let's say in the outer chatzer, or to pass through it. So they say we're giving up our rights to the outer chatzer. And that way, according to Rashi, they're giving up their ability even to walk through it. In other words, that's what he says. He says, the drisat regel, we're giving up everything to you, so that way we don't impinge upon you. We're going to seal off for this Shabbat. Okay? So that's the case where Bitul Reshut works. Now, what's a case where where he says, in a case where ma'arvin ve'en osrin, you can make an eruv, but there's no prohibition, en mevatlin, in that case, they can't do bitul. So what's this case? Kigon bet chatzirot upetach achat benhem. That if you have two chatzirot and there's an opening between them, so why is that a case where they can make an eruv but there's no prohibition? Because you have two chatzirot, each one opens to the public domain itself, but they have an opening between them. They can decide to all become one chatzer or not. Now, if they don't become one chatzer, they don't interfere with one another. Each one is independent anyway. So there's no prohibition there. It's just that if they wanted to unite into one chatzer, they could. Let's say they decide they each want to be independent. So in the Chatzer number 1, they can carry all Shabbat. Chatzer number 2, they can carry all Shabbat. But from 1 to 2, they can't carry. So fine, they don't care about that. They don't want to. So, but they don't prohibit each other from carrying in their own Chatzerot. Whereas in the inner and outer case, the inner Chatzer not having an Eruv is actually going to make the outer guy not be able to carry in his own Chatzer, unless they're mivatel their rights to that Chatzer and they give up to him. Here there's no impinging, so therefore en mivatlin. The rabbis didn't allow you to use the mechanism of bitul reshut, of giving up your rights to the Chatzer, unless there was an issue of prohibition. In other words, if I'm interfering with your life, then I can be mivatel, I can give up my rights to the Chatzer so as to remove my interference with your life. But if I'm not interfering with you, so why should the rabbis let me rely on the leniency of bitul reshut?
Why would you even want to use it?
Let's say the people in Chatzer number 1 wanted to allow the people from Chatzer number 2 to come into their domain on Shabbat and bring stuff into their domain on Shabbat. So they could say, we're giving up our rights to carry into our own domain, so now you can come in and carry into our domain. Right? They just want to be nice to them. Since there's no prohibition, they just want to be even nicer. That doesn't allow bitul reshut. If you wanted to do that, you should have made an eruv for everybody in both chatzerot. Don't just be mevatel reshut. Mevatel reshut is something we use in an emergency. So that's why we don't use it in that case. And now, what's the last case where you have osrin ve'en ma'arvin and mevatlin? What about a case where osrin ve'en ma'arvin? There's a case where there's a prohibition, but there's no solution with eruv. And since there's no solution with eruv, there's also no solution with bitul reshut. So what case is that? La tuye mai. Lav la tuye nuchri. We are obviously talking about a case with a non-Jew. That's the case where you have a prohibition. You can't use the chatzer because the non-Jew is there, but you can't make eruv either. Unless you rent from him. But we're saying where you didn't rent. So if we're talking about yesterday, that he came on Friday, you should be able to rent from him. So why is it telling me that there's no solution? Ve'en ma'arvin and en mevatlin, that I can't do bitul reshut and I cannot do eruv. Why is that? So if he came yesterday, I'll rent from him me'etmol. Ella, we turn to Amud Bet, lav da'ata b'shabbat. We're talking about a case where he came on Shabbat. And what is it telling you? V'katane osrin ve'en me'arvin ve'en mevatlin shema'mina. So what do you see from Shmuel then? What is the case that he must have had in mind when he said, if you have a prohibition to carry in a chatzer, and you cannot make an eruv, then you also can't do a bitul reshut. What case must he have been talking about? He must have been talking about a case where the non-Jew came on Shabbat. And therefore he prohibited them, so they couldn't make an eruv because it was Shabbat. They couldn't do bitul reshut because they had the non-Jew there, and obviously they couldn't rent from him even on Shabbat. Because if they could have rented from him on Shabbat, then they could have done bitul reshut. They should have been able to.
What happened to what you said earlier about what we had learned in the past? If you can rent from...
This is a contradiction. That's the whole point. Yeah, that's why they said that. Rabbi Yochanan said that, and then Rabbi Elazar was bothered by it. And Rabbi Zera said, "Why are you bothered by it?" And he said, "I'm bothered by it because of the teaching of Shmuel. Shmuel clearly implies here that in the case there's a prohibition and you can't do anything. And what's the only possibility where you can't do absolutely anything? Right, the only case where you can't do absolutely anything is where the non-Jew shows up on Shabbat. Now if it were possible to rent and then do bitul reshut, you should have said that. Okay, so obviously Shmuel doesn't hold by this. So Amar Rav Yosef says, Lo Shemi Ali Hashemata. I never heard this teaching before, said Rav Yosef. Now Rav Yosef had like Alzheimer's or something. He had some kind of disease, I just call it that because I'm not sure what else to call it, but basically in his old age, he started to forget everything. Yeah, he couldn't remember things that he had learned and things that he himself had taught. So a lot of times his students would remind him, yes, he would say, I don't remember this teaching, and his students would say, yes, you taught it. So Rav Yosef said, I don't remember this teaching of Shmuel about the inner courtyard and the outer courtyard. That the inner courtyard is allowed to give up its rights to the outer courtyard so that it won't impinge upon the outer courtyard. Because since the inner courtyard didn't make an Eruv, and those non-Eruved bad people, now from the fact that they have access to the outer courtyard, are also going to ruin the lives of the people in the outer courtyard, therefore we allow them to give up their rights to the outer courtyard. He said, I never heard this before. Amar le Abaye, I said to him, At Amrat Nialan, you taught it to us. Amrat Nialan, and it was in this context that you taught it to us. Amar Shmuel, because Shmuel said, En bitul reshut nechatzer lachatzer, ve'en bitul reshut bechorba. Because Shmuel said, you cannot do bitul reshut, you cannot give up the rights, your rights to a courtyard, mechatzer lachatzer, from one chatzer to another one. In other words, the people living in chatzer A, who may have some kind of rights to Chatzer B, are not allowed to do Bitul Rishut and give up their rights to the people in Chatzer B. It doesn't work like that. And Ve'en Bitul Rishut Bechorba. And if you have in between two houses a ruined area, a ruin of some sort, which is an area that I guess could be used for whatever kinds of activity. It's shared between two homes. You can't do Bitul Rishut. One house cannot say, we don't want it, you can have it. So it's shared between the two of them. So unless they made an Eruv, they wouldn't be able to use it. Va'amratlan, and you told us, Allah, about this statement, Ki amar Shmuel en bitul reshut mechatzer lachatzer, lo amaran el shetei chatzerot, upetach achad benehen. That Shmuel, the only time when he said that two people, or two chatzerot rather, two courtyards, cannot do bitul, they cannot give up their rights one to the other one. That was only when you have the two chatzerot that are side by side who share a common door. Because they're side by side and they share a common door, why can't they do bitul reshut? Because there's no interference. They can choose to make an eruv and combine the two chatzerot into one, but there's no interference between the two chatzerot that justifies bitul reshut. So therefore, but when you have one inside the other one, since the inner courtyard is actually prohibiting the people in the outer courtyard, they're actually interfering with the lives of the people in the outer courtyard. That's why they're allowed to do bitul reshut. But normally you can't do bitul reshut one courtyard to another. It's only within a courtyard, intra courtyard, not inter courtyard. Okay, you can't have it across courtyards, but except in a case where courtyard A is actually impinging upon courtyard B, then you have the ability to do it. You taught us this in the name of Shmuel. Amar Lei said to him, in other words, Rav Yosef asked Abaye further, Ana amina mishmei de Shmuel? Hachi, I said this in the name of Shmuel? Ve'amar Shmuel, but Shmuel said, Ein lanu be'eruvin, ela kilshon mishnatenu, anshe hatzer, v'lo anshe hatzerot. That didn't Shmuel say that when it comes to Eruvin, all we have is the language of our Mishnah, meaning we go by the literal explanation or the literal statement of the Mishnah. The literal statement of the Mishnah is Anshe Chatzer, the members of a courtyard, Velo Anshe Chatzerot, not the members of courtyards in plural, meaning that we cannot do any bitul reshut across courtyards. We can only do it within a courtyard. Amar Lei, he said to him, Ki amrat lan en lanu be'eruvin ela kilshon mishnatenu. You told us that this idea that we go by the literal meaning of the Mishnah, aha amrat lan, that was applicable only to the following case: sheha mavoi lachatzerot kehatzer labatim. That the mavoi with respect to chatzerot is like the chatzer with respect to the houses. In other words, just like a mavoi, an alleyway needs to be two chatzerot opening to it to be considered an alleyway. A chatzer, a courtyard, in order to be a courtyard, has to have at least two homes opening to it. So in order to have a mavoi, you have to have two chatzerot, each of which has within it 2 homes minimum. That's what you told us was the literal interpretation of the Mishnah. But when it comes to Bitul Rishut, there could actually be an exception to the rule, where we do actually allow the people in the inner courtyard, since they're impinging upon the people in the outer courtyard, to give up their right to the outer courtyard. Gufa, we go back to something we said before. Amar Shmuel, Shmuel says, "En bitul rishut nechatzer lachatzer, v'en bitul rishut bechorba," that we cannot give up rights. The people in one chatzer cannot give up their rights, their proprietary rights to the space, to people in another chatzer. And people living in 2 houses that are adjacent, that share a certain sort of vacant lot between them, cannot give up the rights to the vacant lot that they share between them. Rabbi Yochanan amar Rabbi Yochanan, in other words, one cannot give it to the other one. Rabbi Yochanan amar yesh bitul rishut mechatzer lachatzer. Rabbi Yochanan says, actually, I disagree. People in chatzer A that's adjacent to Chatzer B and they share a wall, even though they don't impinge upon one another, they don't interfere, and they didn't make an Eruv, the people in Chatzer A can say to the people in Chatzer B, you know what, we give up our rights to carrying, we're not going to carry out of our houses, this Chatzer, it's all yours, you can have it. They're allowed to do it, and vice versa, the people in Chatzer B could do that to the people in Chatzer A. And, moreover, he says, V'yesh bitul rishut b'chorba. If you have 2 homes, each house they have in between them some kind of a vacant area. The people in one house can give up their rights to the vacant area to the people in the other house. The people in the other house could decide to give up their rights to the vacant area to the people in house A. Utzricha, and we need to know both of these cases. Why? Even though they seem similar. Because if Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan only argued about the case of 2 chatzerot, we would say, okay, we understand why Shmuel is so stringent, because these are 2 totally different entities. They don't really share any space. One courtyard is independent, the other courtyard is independent, and one just wants to give up its rights to the other courtyard. So Shmuel says, why do they have to do that? It's not necessary. It's gratuitous. Why should we let them do it? Aval chorba ditashmishta chada litarvayu. But this vacant lot in between the 2 homes, each home has only the vacant lot. In other words, they share it. They actually do share it. So it makes sense. Ema modeli Rabbi Yochanan. Maybe we would have thought that he would allow the people in house A to give up their rights to the vacant lot for the sake of the people in house B. Maybe they would allow the people in house B to give up their rights to the vacant lot for the people in house A, because they do actually share the space. And the answer is no, that even there he doesn't allow it. And if you're going to tell me the case of the 2 chatzerot, Rabbi Yochanan, maybe you'll tell me that it was in that case that Rabbi Yochanan allows that Rabbi Yochanan is going to allow.
Excuse me, my interruption. I bring these candles. I don't know whom I have to
Leave them here.
Oh yeah, leave them. We'll take them. No problem.
We'll take them.
Yeah. So, where was I?
I'll take them to the office.
Thank you. I didn't know she was waiting for us. Okay. Where were we? Right, so if we only knew the case of the chatzerot, so fine. So there we could see why Shmuel would be stringent, because they're totally independent. Maybe he would be lenient in the case of the houses. And if we only knew the case of the houses that share the vacant lot, maybe you'd say, well, that's why Rabbi Yochanan is lenient, because they actually share the house. They actually share this vacant lot. So we understand why he's being lenient. But in the case of the 2 chatzerot, maybe he would say, yeah, why do they need to do bitul rishut, one to the other one? Why do they each have their own space? This is not a shared space, really. It's gratuitous. So therefore you need both cases to show you that Shmuel is stringent in both cases, and Rabbi Yochanan is lenient in both cases. So that's why it says that Behak Amar Rabbi Yochanan aval Behak model Shmuel tzricha. That's why you need both. Amar Abaye. Abaye says Had Amar Shmuel en bitul rishut nechatzer lachatzer lo Amaran ela b'shtei chatzerot upetach achat benehen. So this is what we said so far. In other words, he's restating what we've assumed up till now. That when the Shmuel say that one chatzer cannot give up its rights to another chatzer, that's only when they're side by side. Okay, but when one is within the other one, such that it actually impinges upon and prohibits the use of the outer chatzer if it doesn't have an eruv, there we would say, let the people in the inner chatzer give up their rights to the outer chatzer, so that the people in the outer chatzer at least are not affected by it. Why should we have them interfere? So therefore they can do bitul reshut. Rava says no. Afilu b'shtei chatzerot zo lifnei mizo, pamim mevatlein, pamim en mevatlein. Rava says no. It depends. Even when one chatzer is within the other, okay. Still, there are cases where we will say that they can do bitul reshut, and there are cases where we're not going to allow them to do bitul reshut. Let's see what the cases are. So he says, ketzat natnu eruvan b'chitzona. Let's say, and now what we're talking about here is not necessarily the entire, all the members of the chatzer doing bitul reshut. We're talking about where the people made an eruvei chatzerot. In other words, the people in the inner courtyard and the outer courtyard joined together in one eruvei chatzerot, but somebody was a naysayer, or somebody forgot. The question is, can he do bitul reshut? Okay, so let's take a look at the case. So ketzad. So natnu eruvan b'chitzona. Let's say the eruv was located in the outer courtyard, but this is an eruv for both courtyards. V'shachach echad min ha'penimit, o ben min ha'penimit, o ben min ha'chitzona, v'lo erev. But somebody, either a member of the outer courtyard or a member of the inner courtyard, forgot to participate in the eruv. So then, shetehen asurot. There's nothing we can do. He's going to explain why this is. Natnu eruvan b'penimit. If they placed the eruv in the inner courtyard, that's where it was located. So the people of the outer courtyard joined with the people in the inner courtyard. That's how it was structured. Okay, if that's the case, if somebody from the inner courtyard forgot, there's nothing they can do. But okay, so if somebody from the outer courtyard forgot to participate, so then the inner courtyard is fine, only the outer courtyard is in trouble. So let's see how that works. So the question is, why is that so problematic? If you have the eruv in the outer courtyard, if anybody forgot to participate, it prohibits everyone. What's the reason? Because the only solution here would be bitul reshut, right? If somebody gives up their rights. So who's going to give up their rights? If somebody in the inner courtyard forgot, so he needs to give up his rights. But who's he going to give up his rights to? If he gives up his rights to the people in the inner courtyard with him, they're not the ones that have the eruv. The eruv is in the outer courtyard. And we just said that you can't do bitul reshut from one courtyard to another. So we can't. So the people who actually hold the power, so to speak, who hold the eruv, are the people in the outer chatzer. And this guy can't give up his rights to the people in his own chatzer because they don't have the eruv. He has to give them up to the people in the outer chatzer, and they are in another chatzer, so he can't do it because we said en mevatlin mereshut lereshut. However, let's say an outer guy forgot to do it. So then leman niftil livnei chitzona ikapenimit asra alayu. Okay, so if he wanted to give up his rights, let's say a person in the outer chatzer was the one who forgot to participate. So if he forgot to participate, he can give up his rights to the people in the outer courtyard, but the problem is ikapenimit asra alayu. But he's not connecting to the people in the inner courtyard. He's only giving up his rights to the people in the outer courtyard. So how does that take care of the people in the inner courtyard? And if he tries to give up his rights to the people in the inner courtyard, he can't do that. So the point is that if you have a situation where, let's just rehash, if you have a situation where the eruv is located in the outer courtyard, so the problem is that if the person who is excluded is in the outer courtyard, he has no way to give up his rights to the people in the inner courtyard. Because you can't give up your rights to somebody who lives in another courtyard.
Even though there's an eruv between the two?
It doesn't matter. Because the eruv is between people. But he didn't participate in it. So he's not allowed to give up his rights. Let's say he wants to say, let's say he lives in the inner courtyard and he says, I want to give up my rights to this courtyard, to the people in the inner courtyard. That's okay, but what about the people in the outer courtyard? Well, you can't give up your rights to somebody who lives in the outer courtyard. So then, and if the people if the person's in the outer courtyard, he can say, I want to give up my rights to the people in my courtyard. But what about the people in the inner courtyard that are part of the Eruv too? He can't give up his rights to his part of the area to the people in the inner courtyard. So it's not going to work anyway. Okay, so now so this is a qualification of Shmuel, because Shmuel had said that if you have an inner and outer courtyard, that the Bitul Rishut should work. Right? The Bitul Rishut should work across courtyards. Rava is saying, no, it doesn't work across courtyards, even in this case. So natnu eruvan b'pnimit. Let's say they put the eruv in the inner courtyard. V'shachach echad min ha'pnimit lo erev shteyan asurot. Hai bar pnimit leman niftil levnei ha'pnimit ikach chitzonad asur alayu. Niftil levnei chitzon and Bitul Rishut mechatzer lachatzer. So in the second case, where is the eruv located? In the inner courtyard. You have the same problem. If the guy in the inner courtyard forgot, so what's he going to do? If he is mivatel, if he gives up his rights to the people with him in the inner courtyard, that doesn't include the people on the outside, who are part of the Eruv as well. If he wants to give up his rights to the people in the outer courtyard, you can't do that. Because in bitul merishut l'rishut, you can't mechatzer l'chatzer. You can't do it from chatzer to chatzer. You can't give it up to the people in the other chatzer. So we turn to Samach Zayin Amud Aleph. Shachach echad min hachitzona v'lo erev. So now we have the final case. What happens when somebody in the outer courtyard forgot to become part of the Eruv? Okay, somebody in the outer courtyard. Where is the Eruv though? It's in the inner courtyard this time. So what is the case? Vadai penimit muteret da'achadad dasha u'mishtamsha v'chitzona asura. So in that case, it's actually very simple. The inner courtyard has no problem. Why not? Because they can close their door and say, we don't want anything to do with you. Because they have the Eruv in their courtyard. So they don't need the outer people. The outer people are the source of the problem because one of them forgot to be involved. See, if the Eruv was in the outer courtyard, then the inner courtyard is dependent on them. They can't close the door. But in this case, the Eruv is actually physically located in the inner courtyard. So what can they do? Seal off the door. Say, you know what? We don't want anything to do with you.
The guy from the outer courtyard who forgot.
Right. He can't do
beat. Close the door when the inner courtyard guys close the door.
Right.
Keep their own Eruv. Mm-hmm. Can't he then rebuttal his part to his guys in the outer courtyard? But they can't make an Eruv then.
They can't make an Eruv because it's too late. So what does Rashi explain? So Rashi says this. He says, Beha modei Shmuel d'mevatle b'nei chitzona l'bnei pnimit. What's the only case where Shmuel agrees that people in one courtyard can give up their rights to people in the other courtyard? It's in this case alone. In all the other cases, it doesn't work. But in this case, he's going to allow it. Why? Because the people in the outer courtyard can give up their rights to the to the people in the inner courtyard. Why? Because oto reshut shebalehem letochan al yedei hergel eruvan mishum de'amar la letakonei shetaftich v'lo la'avotei. Because they will say to the people in the outer courtyard, we joined with you to help, not to ruin our Eruv. We were perfectly fine. We have a perfectly fine Eruv in the inner courtyard. We don't need you. And now, because we wanted to join with you, and one of your guys messed up, now we're stuck. So since the inner courtyard is independent fundamentally of the outer courtyard, they can say that. They're totally independent. They have the Eruv and they have the ability to seal themselves off. So because they're totally independent, that's why the outer courtyard can now give up their rights to the courtyard, since they can't use it anyway, because now they're stuck anyway. Right? So they can give up their rights to the outer courtyard to the people in the inner courtyard. And now the inner courtyard people can at least use the entire area. Because the outer courtyard is they're the ones that messed up. But in no other case does Shmuel allow the people in one courtyard to be mivatel their reshut to people in another courtyard. Now, according to the first opinion, according to the first version that we saw earlier, we were saying that the people in the outer courtyard could always be mivatel their reshut to the people in the inner courtyard. Right? That they could always do it. Right? Or that they.
Shmuel was saying earlier that the people in the inner courtyard were messing it up with the people in the outer courtyard, and the people in the inner courtyard could, in that case, mevatel their reshut to.
Right? Either way. In other words, it could go in either direction. In other words, according to the first version, what we were assuming was whoever's interfering with whom They can give up their rights in the courtyard to the other one. But according to this version, according to what Rava is saying, is no, it's more limited. It's in a case where the people in the inner courtyard made an eruv. They're really essentially independent, and these people in the outer courtyard are ruining it for them because of an attempt to join with them. There we say the people in the outer courtyard can be mivatel, but let's say the other way, that the inner courtyard didn't make an eruv, and they're ruining it for the people in the outer courtyard because they opened to the outer courtyard. There he would say, no, that's not true. There it's not so simple that they can be mivatel their rights to the outer courtyard. Okay. But here, in this case, they can. So Amar le Rav Huna bred Rav Yoshua le Rava. Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yoshua, said to Rava, V'chi shachach echad min hapinimit v'lo erev. When somebody in the inner courtyard forgets and didn't participate in the eruv, amai shetehen asurot. So why is it that both are prohibited? In other words, why is it that everyone is prohibited if somebody in the inner courtyard, in this case, forgets to participate in the eruv? Because why can't we say this? Livtil bar penimit libnei penimit. Why can't we just say this? That the person who's in the inner courtyard will give up his rights to the people in the inner courtyard who hold the eruv anyway. Okay, so he's done. He gave up his rights to the people in the inner courtyard. No problem. And now the people in the outer courtyard are also joined with the inner courtyard, so everyone's good.
That's what I was trying to say.
Right, so why can't you do it as a chain? The inner courtyard and outer courtyard are linked. The guy who's in the inner courtyard just give up his rights to the rest of the people in the inner courtyard. He doesn't have to cross over the boundaries of the courtyards. He's giving it to the people in his own courtyard. Now they're all connected. So what's the problem with doing that? So he says, "Keman ke Rabbi Eliezer, damar eno tzarich levatel reshut lekol echad v'echad." Who would that work according to? Only according to Rabbi Eliezer, because Rabbi Eliezer says that if you do bitul reshut, you only have to give up your rights to one person in the courtyard. You don't have to give it to everybody. But according to the way that we said, okay, according to the Rabbanan. But we're saying according to the rabbis. The rabbis say that bitul reshut doesn't mean that I give up my rights to one of the 10 people. I have to give up my rights to all of the 10 people, which means not only the people on my side, not only the people in my chatzer, but even the people in the other chatzer. So, and since they're in another chatzer, there's no way for me to do it. If it would be enough to give up my rights to the people in my chatzer, to one of the people, I would just give it up to the people in my chatzer, and then everyone's connected. But since you have to personally give it up to each one of the 10 people, the 5 people in chatzer A and the 5 people in chatzer B, and I can't give up my rights to somebody living in a chatzer other than me, other than my own, so that means that there's no way, really, essentially, that I will be able to pull it off in that situation. The only case, according to Rava, where there's a legitimate solution is where the eruv is in the inner courtyard, and everybody in the inner courtyard did what they were supposed to do, and that one person in the outer courtyard messed up. Now that one person in the outer courtyard normally would not be able to be mevatel his reshut to everybody. He normally wouldn't be able to do that, because he wouldn't be able to be mevatel his reshut to the people in the inner courtyard. But since they're totally independent in principle, and the outer courtyard is doing nothing but ruining it for them, so the rabbis allowed the person to give up his rights to the courtyard in order to enable everyone to carry, because otherwise he's holding everybody back, even though that meant being mevatel his reshut to people in another chatzer. But in all other cases, we don't allow bitul reshut from one chatzer to another.